Right. So you know how sometimes you just get this urge, this like thirst for knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
That's me right now with environmental impact assessments,
Yeah.
EIAs. So we're diving deep into this book, trying to unpack it all.
Yeah, it can be a lot to get your head around.
Oh, tell me about it. So, like, what's the deal with these EIAs? Are they actually making a difference out there in the real world?
Oh, absolutely. It's a global thing, really. I mean, it's gone from like this kind of radical idea back in the 70s to like a standard practice worldwide.
Seriously.
Oh, yeah. EIAs are all about making sure projects, and we're talking big projects here, they're done in a way that, respects the environment and communities in the long run.
So it's more than just like checking a box. It's about preventing like environmental disasters.
Exactly. We're talking about avoiding those oops, didn't think of that moments that can have, some pretty nasty consequences.
Okay, that's way more intense than just environmental paperwork.
Mm-hmm.
So how did this whole thing get started?
Well, a big turning point was the U.S. National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, back in 1970.
Yeah.
Basically, it just said, hey, before we go building something huge that could really mess with the environment, let's, take a step back and figure out what those impacts might be.
Okay, makes sense.
And how to minimize them.
So it's like looking before you leap, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about predicting the future of the environment. And that seems, well, incredibly complex. How do they even begin to do that?
Well, yeah, it is complex, but that's where the whole, detective work of EIA comes in, right? It all begins with something called scoping. Basically, experts gather a ton of information, looking for any potential environmental concerns.
So looking for any red flags?
Yeah, we're talking about air and water quality. What about the wildlife, their habitats, even, cultural resources? They look at everything.
So they are looking for those red flags.
Exactly.
Okay.
And once they've figured out what those potential impacts might be, then they move on to the impact assessment phase. And this is where it gets really interesting. This is where they use some seriously cool science, computer modeling, and data analysis, even going out into the field to study stuff, all to try and predict how the environment might change because of a project.
Wow. So it's about connecting the dots between the project and like what could happen because of it.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the tools they use for this, which I find fascinating, is network analysis. This book actually gives an example of how a new dam, right, could actually affect fish populations miles downstream.
What?
Oh, yeah, just by changing, the way the water flows, how sediment moves downstream, it's all connected.
Like a domino effect. You wouldn't think a dam in one spot would impact something so far away. What else are they doing to make these predictions more accurate?
Well, technology is really shaking things up. They're using things like geographic information systems, GIS, and remote sensing to create these incredibly detailed maps and visualizations. It's not just about looking at numbers on a spreadsheet anymore. It's like you can actually see the potential changes on the landscape.
It's got to have such a bigger impact, right? Like seeing is believing. If you can actually visualize those impacts, that's powerful.
Absolutely. And it helps people connect with the issue on a deeper level.
For sure. It's one thing to be told that a project might, impact the local ecosystem, but to actually see it, to see those impacts mapped out, that's a game changer.
Exactly. It makes it real.
Okay, so let's say these EIAs do uncover some serious environmental concerns. What happens then? Do you just scrap the whole project?
Not always, no. That's where mitigation comes in.
Mitigation?
Yeah, it's all about finding ways to, avoid or minimize or even offset those impacts.
So it's like finding a compromise. Like, okay, we really want to build this bridge, but we also really don't want to mess with, like, the birds or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It's about finding that balance. This book actually gives a really cool example of a wind farm project. They used an EIA to figure out the best place to put the turbines so they wouldn't, interfere with migrating birds.
Oh, that's interesting. I never would have thought you could plan for something like that.
Oh, yeah. You totally can. It's about, like you said, finding that sweet spot where we can, have our cake and eat it, too.
Exactly. So it's not just about saying no to everything.
Right.
It's about finding solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And those solutions, they can look like a lot of different things, right? Sometimes it's about tweaking the project design, like, say, using quieter construction techniques so you're not disturbing, sensitive areas.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or sometimes it's about, doing some restoration work somewhere else to make up for any unavoidable impacts.
So it's like a big puzzle, figuring out how to make it all work.
It really is.
This book also talked about how important public engagement is in this whole EIA process. What's the thinking there? Why is that so important?
Well, I think it's about recognizing that, local communities, they often have this incredible depth of knowledge about their environment, stuff that, might not be obvious to outsiders.
Right, like they know the land.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And who better to, to weigh in on these projects than the people who actually live there, right?
Yeah.
They're the ones who are going to be most affected.
Totally. So does this book give any real world examples of how that's worked out well?
Yeah, actually, there's a really interesting case study about a hydropower project. It was in South America, and they did a ton of consultation with the indigenous communities who lived along the river.
Oh, wow.
And you know what? Their input, it actually led to some significant changes in the project design.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Changes that ended up protecting both, the environment and their cultural heritage.
That's incredible. So it's not just about checking a box. It's about actually listening to people and taking their knowledge seriously.
Ex-
Now, I'm curious about how all this plays out in different industries. I imagine a wind farm has very different environmental considerations than, say, an oil and gas project.
Oh, for sure. Each industry comes with its own, its own set of quirks.
Right.
The book actually digs into this, contrasting renewable energy projects like, the wind farm we talked about with some of the challenges of, say, oil and gas extraction.
Okay, so give me an example. What's an example of a unique challenge for an EIA in the oil and gas industry?
Well, they talk about the Mekong River Basin
Okay.
and the whole issue of cumulative impacts.
Cumulative impacts. What does that mean?
So you've got multiple oil and gas operations, right? But then you've also got all these other things going on, other industries, agriculture, and they all add up. You can't just look at one project in isolation. You have to look at the combined effect of everything that's happening in that river system.
So it's like everything's connected.
Exactly.
And it can be really hard to tease apart those impacts, right?
It can be incredibly complex, yeah. And it really highlights the need for, a more holistic approach, one that takes the long view, things about the big picture and the long-term consequences.
This is blowing my mind. It's like realizing that your body is this complex ecosystem and everything's connected.
That's a great analogy.
Right. You can't just look at one organ in isolation. You have to understand how it all works together.
I like that. And just like, our bodies have to adapt to changes, so too do our approaches to EIA, especially with something as, unpredictable and potentially game-changing as climate change.
That's a really good point. I was just thinking about that. Climate change is it's the ultimate wild card.
It really is.
How are EIIs even beginning to wrap their heads around something as big and unpredictable as climate change?
It's a huge challenge, for sure. But the book does talk about how, EIAs are starting to routinely include these climate change assessments.
Okay, so they're taking it seriously.
Yeah, definitely more and more. So it's not just about looking at, the greenhouse gas emissions from a project. It's also about asking, okay, how might this project be vulnerable to, to the effects of climate change?
Right, so like sea level rise or extreme weather.
Exactly. More intense storms, changes in rainfall patterns, it all has to be factored in.
Yeah.
Because, we can't just be building for today's climate.
We have to be thinking long term.
Absolutely.
The book also mentioned nuclear power.
Right.
And the unique challenges it poses for EIA just because of the long-term risks involved. I mean, we're talking about radioactive waste that has to be managed for centuries.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other level.
Right.
Yeah.
So, how do you even begin to assess those risks over such a long time scale?
It's incredibly difficult, and there's a lot of debate about the best way to do it. But, the fact that they're even trying, that they're having these conversations, it's crucial.
Right. It seems like this whole field of EIA, it's constantly evolving to try and keep pace with, new technologies, our growing understanding of how we're impacting the planet. It's a lot.
It's a never-ending process, but that's kind of exciting in a way.
Yeah, it is. It feels hopeful.
Definitely. And the book talks about how technology is going to continue to play a huge role.
Okay, what kind of technology?
Well, they specifically talk about artificial intelligence, AI.
No way. AI and the environment. That sounds like something out of, a science fiction movie.
It does, right. But it's actually already happening. They're using AI to analyze these massive data sets of environmental information, looking for patterns, making predictions about how ecosystems might change, and that can help make those EIAs way more precise.
So like having a crystal ball for the environment.
Kind of, yeah. It's pretty wild. And it means we can start to, to anticipate problems, ideally even prevent them before they even happen.
That's amazing. It sounds like we're on the cusp of some really exciting advancements in this field. But it can feel a little overwhelming, right? All this technology, all this complex analysis.
Yeah, it can be a lot to take in.
Where do you even begin?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that, at its heart, EIA is about something very simple. It's about making smart choices.
About how we interact with the planet.
Exactly. And the science, the technology, it's all just tools to help us make better decisions, ultimately.
So it's not just about the experts, it's about all of us.
Exactly.
And that's where our listeners come in, right?
100%. This book really hammers home the point that public engagement, it's not just some box to be ticked.
Right.
It is a fundamental part of the whole EIA process.
So, okay, I'm like someone who cares about the environment, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not a scientist. What can I actually do to make a difference?
Oh, so many things. First off, just be aware. What are the EIA processes in your own community?
Okay.
Are there any projects in the works, stuff that could impact your local environment?
Right.
Show up, go to public hearings, make your voice heard, share what you know.
So it's about, becoming an advocate for the places that matter to you.
Exactly. And even just staying informed. That's huge.
Okay.
Read those environmental impact statements. Don't be afraid to ask questions, and have those conversations with the people making the decisions.
So knowledge is power.
Big time. The more you know, the more you can actually shape the future.
I love that. This has been such a fascinating deep dive.
It really has.
Just this whole world of EIAs. I feel like we've all learned so much.
Me too. It really highlights how we all have a role to play in making sure, that as we develop, as we grow, that we're doing it in a way that benefits both, people and the planet.
It's not just about avoiding the negative.
Right.
It's about finding those creative solutions, embracing those new technologies.
Absolutely.
And really, it's about working together.
Couldn't agree more.
To create that better future.
Yeah. It's a team effort, for sure.
So to our listeners, the next time you hear about, some big project happening in your community, remember what we talked about today.
Yeah.
Ask those questions. Get involved. Make your voice heard. You might be surprised at the impact you can have.
You absolutely can, because ultimately, we all share this planet.
That's it for this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed this closer look at environmental impact assessments. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and